there's a place where the Federation never existed, where compassion is weakness, where betrayal is advancement, and where humanity became everything Star Trek teaches us not to be. The mirror universe, Star Trek's darkest timeline. A parallel reality where first contact with the Vulcans ended not with a handshake, but with murder. Where the Terran Empire conquered the galaxy through brutality and oppression. Where your favorite heroes wear goatees and gold sashes, torture their subordinates, and assassinate their way to the captain's chair. Today, we're exploring the complete history of the mirror universe, from humanity's violent divergence from the prime timeline, through the rise and fall of the Terran Empire, to the Klingon-Cardassian Alliance that enslaved humanity, and finally to the Terran Rebellion that would change everything. This is the story of what happens when humanity chooses conquest over cooperation, when strength trumps compassion, and when the optimistic future of Star Trek becomes a nightmare reflection of our darkest impulses. Let's step through the looking glass. The mirror universe didn't always exist as a separate reality. For most of Earth's history, both timelines ran parallel, experiencing the same events. Ancient Greece, Rome, the Renaissance, all happened identically in both universes. But somewhere millennia ago, the timelines began to diverge. Emperor Philippa Georgiou stated that the ideals of equality, freedom, and compassion were delusions Terrans shed millennia ago. This suggests the split happened long before modern history, perhaps in antiquity. Mirror Phlox discovered that Shakespeare's works were equally grim in both universes, suggesting that by the 16th century, both realities shared similar darkness in their literature, even as their cultures developed differently. By the 20th century, the Terran Empire was already established as a political entity on Earth. In 2155, Captain Jonathan Archer mentioned that the Empire had existed for centuries, meaning it traces back to at least the 18th or 19th century, possibly longer. Various theories exist about the Empire's origins. Some suggest it's a continuation of the Roman Empire. Others point to a different outcome in World War II, or perhaps a series of wars that resulted in a single totalitarian regime dominating Earth. The truth remains shrouded in mystery. What we know for certain is that by the mid-21st century, Earth in the mirror universe was unified under the Terran Empire, a militaristic, xenophobic regime built on conquest and oppression. And they were about to meet their first aliens. Humanity's first contact with an alien species in the mirror universe began exactly as it did in the traditional universe. Upon detecting Zephram Cochrane's warp signature, the Vulcan scout ship T-Planaheth landed in Bozeman, Montana, to make first contact with humanity. But what happened next changed everything. In the Prime universe, Cochrane shook hands with the Vulcan commander, marking the beginning of humanity's journey to the stars and eventual founding of the Federation. In the mirror universe, Cochrane pulled out a shotgun and killed the Vulcan. The humans seized the Vulcan ship and its advanced technology. Rather than joining an interstellar community as equals, the Terrans reverse-engineered Vulcan warp technology and used it to launch a campaign of conquest. First contact became first murder, and the pattern was set. By the 22nd century, the Terran Empire had spread across the stars, conquering Vulcan, Andoria, Teller Prime, Badger, Denobula, and Gorlin. The conquered species were enslaved, their resources stripped, their populations subjugated. This wasn't exploration, it was exploitation. By 2155, the Terran Empire faced a crisis. Despite conquering numerous worlds, they were losing a war against their enemies. Rebellions were spreading. The Empire needed an edge. That's when the Tholians captured something extraordinary. The USS Defiant, a Constitution-class starship from the 23rd century Prime Universe that had time-traveled to the 22nd century Mirror Universe. The Defiant was a century more advanced than anything the Empire possessed. Commander Jonathan Archer of the ISS Enterprise staged a mutiny, killing Captain Maximilian Forrest, and led a raid into Tholian space to capture the Defiant. Archer's plan was simple: use the Defiant's superior technology to conquer all known space and declare himself emperor. But Archer never made it home. His communications officer, Hoshi Sato, poisoned him with help from his bodyguard Travis Mayweather. The two took control of the Defiant, and upon arriving at Terra, Sato declared herself Empress Hoshi Sato the First. It remains unclear whether Sato actually established herself as Empress, or if the Defiant played any further role in the Mirror Universe. But the technology gave the Terran Empire the advantage it needed. Using the Defiant's advanced systems, the Empire conquered all of known space, even rendering Kano S, the Klingon homeworld, uninhabitable. The Terran Empire reached its zenith, dominating the Alpha Quadrant with an iron fist. By the mid-23rd century, the Terran Empire was the dominant power in the galaxy, ruling through terror and brutality. Discipline aboard Imperial Starfleet vessels was enforced through agony booths, torture devices that inflicted excruciating pain. Officers carried agonizers, handheld devices that could punish subordinates with agonizing shocks. Advancement came through assassination. Officers killed their superiors, who they deemed incompetent. And this was not just accepted, but expected. The ISS Enterprise was the flagship of the Imperial Starfleet, commanded by Captain James T. Kirk, a mass murderer who had been promoted after assassinating Captain Christopher Pike. Kirk's orders typically involved suppressing rebellions and enforcing the Empire's will through any means necessary. The ship was equipped with the Tantalus Field, a mysterious and devastating device capable of eliminating individuals from existence with the push of a button. It was the perfect tool for a paranoid captain ruling through fear. Then, in 2267, a transporter accident changed everything. During an ion storm, Captain Kirk, Dr. McCoy, Scotty, and Uhura from the Prime Universe were swapped with their mirror universe counterparts. The Prime Kirk found himself aboard the ISS Enterprise, navigating the dangerous political waters of the Terran Empire, where everyone was an enemy and trust meant death. Kirk quickly grasped the profound differences between the universes. In his reality, Starfleet stood for exploration, diplomacy, and cooperation. Here, it stood for conquest, brutality, and oppression. But Kirk also noticed something unexpected. Mirror Spock, despite wearing a goatee and serving the Empire, harbored grave doubts about the regime. The Vulcan's logical mind had calculated that the Terran Empire was doomed to collapse within a century if it continued its current path. Before returning to his own universe, Kirk challenged Mirror Spock to reform the Empire, to prove that logic could triumph over barbarism, that peace was more sustainable than conquest. Spock listened, and that conversation would doom the Terran Empire. Mirror Spock took Kirk's words to heart. Using logic and his position of power, he eventually rose to become the leader of the Terran Empire, and he began implementing reforms. Spock preached peace, cooperation, and disarmament. He argued that the Empire's brutality was illogical, that conquest was unsustainable, that a civilization built on oppression would inevitably fall. He pushed for diplomatic solutions over military ones, for cultural exchange over subjugation. For a time, it seemed like Spock might actually transform the Empire into something resembling the Federation of the Prime Universe. His reforms were radical, but logical, dismantling the systems of terror that had kept the Empire functioning. But Spock's logic failed to account for one crucial variable. The Empire's enemies hadn't reformed, while the Terran Empire disarmed and opened itself to diplomacy. The Klingons and Cardassians were building their own alliance. They watched as the Empire weakened itself, as its military shrunk, as its conquered species began demanding freedom. By the early 24th century, the Empire would be running on fumes, having exhausted most of its resources. Spock's reforms, combined with dwindling resources, left the Empire completely unprepared when the Klingon-Cardassian Alliance attacked. The conquest was swift and brutal. The Terran Empire, which had dominated the galaxy for centuries, fell in what must have seemed like moments. The Alliance conquered Terra itself, enslaving the humans and Vulcans who had once ruled the quadrant. Spock would later be assassinated, causing the crew of the ISS Enterprise to mutiny, steal the ship with the help of Saru, and escape to the Prime Universe with refugees seeking a new life. The irony is crushing. Kirk's attempt to save the mirror universe by inspiring reform actually destroyed it. Compassion in a galaxy that understood only strength was weakness, and weakness was punished with extinction. By 2370, the Klingon-Cardassian Alliance ruled the Alpha Quadrant with the same brutality the Terran Empire once had. The alliance was overseen by a regent, and by 2372, that regent was Worf. Unlike his honorable Prime Universe counterpart, Mirror Worf was a tyrant, ruling through fear and violence. Under him were various intendants who oversaw different sectors of Alliance territory. The most notable intendant was Kira Nerys, who presided over the Cardassian space station, Terok Nor. Mirror Kira was everything Prime Kira wasn't: hedonistic, manipulative, cruel. She ruled through a combination of seduction and terror, using Terran slaves for labor while indulging her own pleasures. The Terrans and Vulcans, who had once conquered the galaxy, were now slaves, forced to work in mines and processing facilities. The Bajorans, who had been oppressed by the Terran Empire, became powerful voices in the Alliance, a complete reversal of their status in both the Prime Universe and the Mirror Universe's own history. But the slaves never stopped resisting. Small acts of sabotage, whispered rebellions, dreams of freedom, these persisted even under the Alliance's brutal rule. Then, in 2370, something extraordinary happened. A runabout from the Prime Universe accidentally crossed through the Bajoran wormhole into the Mirror Universe. Major Kira and Dr. Bashir found themselves on Terok Nor, face to face with their twisted counterparts. Intendant Kira was fascinated by her Prime counterpart and wanted her to stay. But Prime Kira and Bashir escaped with help from Mirror Benjamin Sisko and Miles O'Brien, called Smiley by Sisko. That brief encounter changed everything. Sisko, inspired by the Prime Universe crew, began organizing a Terran Rebellion against the Alliance. The seeds Kirk had planted over a century earlier were finally bearing fruit. But in a way no one could have predicted. The Terran Rebellion started small, scattered acts of resistance. Small groups of fighters striking at Alliance targets and disappearing into the Badlands. But it grew. Mirror Benjamin Sisko became the rebellion's leader, organizing the scattered resistance into something resembling an actual military force. Smiley O'Brien provided technical expertise, building weapons and ships from stolen Alliance technology. In 2372, Captain Sisko from the Prime Universe was kidnapped and forced to impersonate his dead Mirror counterpart. The mission: convince Mirror Jennifer Sisko, a scientist working for the Alliance, to defect to the rebellion. Jennifer had been developing advanced weapons for the Alliance, and losing her would deal them a crippling blow. Sisko succeeded. Jennifer defected, bringing her knowledge with her. But more importantly, she brought something else. The plans for the USS Defiant from the Prime Universe. The rebels, led by Smiley O'Brien, and with help from multiple crossovers with the Prime Universe, constructed their own version of the Defiant. The ISS Defiant became the Rebellion's flagship, a warship powerful enough to fight Alliance vessels on equal terms. In 2372, the Rebellion achieved its greatest victory. They captured Terok, Nor itself. Intendant Kira, the cruel overseer who had ruled the station with an iron fist, lost control to the very slaves she had tormented. Regent Worf personally led an assault fleet to recapture the station. The Battle of Terok Nor should have been a massacre. The Alliance fleet vastly outnumbered the rebels. But the ISS Defiant, with its advanced weapons and capabilities, turned the tide. Worf's fleet was defeated, and the rebels held the station. The Alliance had suffered a humiliating defeat. More importantly, the Terrans had proven they could fight back. The Alliance tried desperately to regain the upper hand. In 2375, Regent Worf attempted to obtain a cloaking device from the Prime Universe. Hopping the technology would help him bring the rebellion back in line. Grand Nagus Sek was captured while on a trip to the Mirror Universe and held for ransom. Worf demanded that Quark and Rome bring him a Klingon cloaking device from the Prime Universe. The two Ferengi were captured and forced to help install the device on Worf's flagship, but Quark and Rome were actually working with the rebellion. Rome adapted the cloaking device so that instead of hiding the ship, it would disable it completely. When Worf activated the device, his flagship went dead in space, a sitting target for the rebels. The rebellion captured Regent Worf himself, the supreme ruler of the Klingon-Cardassian Alliance, taken prisoner by the very people he had enslaved. It was a symbolic victory that signaled the beginning of the end for the Alliance. By 2384, the rebellion was successful in overthrowing the Alliance and restoring the Terran Empire. The slaves had become conquerors once more. But the question remained, what kind of empire would they build? Star Trek, Prodigy Season 2, Episode 14, Cracked Mirror, is now the furthest known point of the Mirror Universe's saga. Cracked Mirror revealed that after Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, the Terran Empire rose again in the late 24th century. The new Terran Empire wasn't reformed or benevolent. It had learned from Spock's mistake. Compassion is weakness, and weakness leads to enslavement. The Terrans adopted their old ways, forming a new Terran armada, and once again beginning to conquer the galaxy. When Captain Chakotay and the USS Protostar crew briefly crossed into the Mirror Universe in the late 24th century, they found themselves aboard the ISS Voyager, taken prisoner by Mirror Admiral Catherine Janeway and Mirror Captain Chakotay. This wasn't the hopeful Starfleet they knew. This was the Terran Armada, brutal, efficient, and determined never to be enslaved again. Mirror Janeway ruled her ship through fear, her crew advanced through assassination, and the Empire had returned to its roots. The cycle had completed. The Terran Empire fell because it became compassionate. The slaves who overthrew the Alliance rebuilt the Empire on the same principles that had once enslaved them. History had come full circle in the darkest possible way. So, what does the mirror universe teach us? On the surface, it's a simple concept. Evil twins with goatees, parallel worlds where everyone is bad. It's fun, it's campy, and it's been a Star Trek staple since 1967. But the mirror universe is really about choices. It shows us that the Federation's optimistic future isn't inevitable. The difference between the enlightened society of Starfleet and the brutal tyranny of the Terran Empire isn't destiny or human nature. It's the choices people make. Zephram Cochrane could have shot the Vulcan or shaken their hand. Mirror Spock could have ignored Kirk's pleas or tried to reform the Empire. The Terran slaves could have built a democracy or restored the Empire. Every step of the way, individuals chose between compassion and cruelty, cooperation and conquest, hope and fear. The tragedy of Mirror Spock is particularly instructive. He made the right choice. Peace is better than war. Cooperation is better than conquest. But he made that choice in a universe that punished it. His logic was sound, but the galaxy wasn't logical. Sometimes doing the right thing leads to disaster if everyone around you chooses wrong. The mirror universe suggests that the line between a peaceful, cooperative society and an oppressive empire is thinner than it appears. It highlights the potential consequences of unchecked aggression, xenophobia, and the erosion of moral principles. One bad choice at first contact, and humanity becomes everything Star Trek teaches us not to be. There's also something darkly honest about the mirror universe's cycle. The Terrans enslaved other species, then were enslaved themselves, then freed themselves, and immediately returned to enslaving others. It suggests that oppression breeds oppression, that victims can become victimizers, that breaking cycles of violence is infinitely harder than perpetuating them. The mirror universe holds up a dark mirror to Star Trek itself. It asks uncomfortable questions. Is the Federation's utopia sustainable? Would humanity really abandon its darker impulses just because we achieved warp drive? What happens when optimism meets species that don't share those values? And most disturbingly, how much of the Terran Empire's brutality exists in all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? As Prime Spock observed after his counterparts were returned to the mirror universe, it was far easier for you, as civilized men, to behave like barbarians. than it was for them as barbarians to behave like civilized men. The mirror universe endures as a Star Trek concept because it's more than just evil twins. It's a reminder that the future we build depends entirely on the choices we make, and that sometimes the only thing separating us from our worst selves is the decision to be better. The Terran Empire rose, fell, and rose again. The cycle continues. And somewhere in that dark reflection of our reality, humans continue making the same choice they've always made: conquest over cooperation, strength over compassion, empire over federation. The mirror universe shows us what happens when humanity looks at the stars and asks not, what can we learn, but what can we take? And the answer, echoing through 2 centuries of brutal history, is always the same: everything, at any cost, forever.